Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Sasquatch Shenanigans. So what happened /x/? I thought that Sasquatch was a topic worth discussing, but after this threads on the topic have stopped. Did people who recognize the probability indicated by giving the evidence a fair examination get tired of arguing past the spamming of her, man in a suit, and ad home? Letting the shills completely spurg out in that thread before they decided that was the best they could do, and just hope that the topic won't be brought up again. I wonder if they'll continue with the same readily identifiable pattern of posting in response.
It's called beating a dead horse. Every thread is a repeat. Give it time and people will be thirsty for it again. The worst way to spend your time is debating the existence of Sasquatch with people who dismiss evidence out of hand, or trying to convince people who have studied the topic to let go of their convictions or what they've learned about it. The best threads on Bigfoot are info dumps. An OP will just drop as much information on the topic as they can and ignore attempts at derailment. These are rare. Shills. That's no different from calling Bigfoot researchers schizos. You don't need to use that word. If someone is being a thick-headed twat, it's clear to all observers. And if someone is a genuine lunatic, it's likewise clear to all observers.
All right, fair enough. I'll be candid and admit that I find actions that can be interpreted as dismissal of evidence out of hand noteworthy, for the reason that they end up illuminating the importance of a pattern of information by their very denial. I find its symmetry fascinating. As far as info goes, the thread before that had a great deal of information offered. Search Patterson Gimlin in 4chan's archives for more.
I grew up in northwestern Nevada along the California border in the foothills of the Sierras. My father was a geologist who preferred working and camping in areas that were as sparsely populated as possible. Between 1970 and 1983, I had a number of encounters in Nevada, California, and Washington states. This first encounter occurred in 1970 on Pevine Mountain northwest of Reno, Nevada. I was 10 at the time and tagging along with my father, who was hunting deer. We were on the western side of the mountain, close to the California border. We were between two ridges crossing a meadow on the western face of the East Ridge. It was about 3:30 p.m., and the sun was beginning to drop behind the trees on the western ridge. There were no clouds and it was still very bright in the meadow, but the shallow draw between the two ridges was heavily shadowed. As my father and I neared the center of the meadow, we heard an extended call coming from the west. We had lived in Kansas until I was 8, and the call reminded me of the World War II air raid siren they used for tornado alerts where we used to live. It began low and relatively quiet and rose in both pitch and volume as it progressed. It lasted for about 15 to 20 seconds before rapidly dropping off. After about 10 seconds, the call was repeated. It seemed to me that it was coming from the draw a couple of 100 yards west and downhill from us. Unlike the tornado siren I was familiar with, it had a mellow, rather than harsh or mechanical quality to it. As the second call ended, I asked my father what was making the noise. Annoyed, he told me that it was just the siren from a fire tower and picked up his pace. That seemed reasonable, and I began looking around at the surrounding high ground for the tower when the call sounded a third time. It seemed to be coming from the draw and seemed to be moving away from us. I caught up with my father and, being a curious 10-year-old, asked him in rapid succession where the tower was and if he smelled any smoke. He replied that it was on the other side of the far ridge and that they were just testing the siren. I told him I thought the call was coming from the draw, and at that point was told to shut up. As the call sounded a fourth time, even further away, my father listened to it and then decided to call it a day. We walked to the Jeep and drove home without further incident. The second encounter took place in the early afternoon in mid-August of 1972. It was bright, sunny, and hot, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit at the time. The wind was less than 5 miles per hour. I was 12. I was with my brother, who was 10, and a friend, David, who was also 12. For years, my brother and I had spent the summers exploring the surrounding hills and valley. We knew all the best places to catch each type of lizard, the best places to look for arrowheads, where the trash dumps from the 1800s were, good for old bottles, and the best places to find old shell casings and such from when the airbase had been active. We didn't often make it out as far as the dry washes, but when we did, we made a point of exploring them because of the unique things like scorpions you could find in them. We had just moved from Stead to the Lemon Valley side of the valley, and David, a new neighbor, was with us for the first and, as it turned out, only time. We had decided to go all the way out to the closest wash to show it to David, and were angling toward one of the shallow points where it would be easier to get into. As we walked along, we were searching the ground for horned toads, arrowheads, and anything else that might be interesting. We were about 20 feet from the wash when we stumbled across an area with jasper and obsidian chips on the ground and started looking around in earnest for arrowheads and other stone tools. My brother and I were seriously competitive when it came to hunting arrowheads. I was facing north, focusing on a piece of jasper I had just found, and had my back to my brother and David when I got a sudden feeling something was wrong. I don't know whether I heard one of them gasp or just go abruptly quiet, but I knew there was a problem. I had a sense of where my brother was a few feet behind me and turned to look at him. As I turned clockwise from north to south, I saw first David, about 25 feet away from me and a couple of feet from the rim of the wash, then what I perceived to be a giant black man about 8 feet from David and about 3 feet away from the wash, and finally my brother, who was only about 5 feet behind me. The giant black man was about 35 feet from me, standing still facing me with his arms at his sides looking directly at me. I guess he must have figured I was the lead male. David was in shock, rooted to the ground, staring directly at him with his mouth wide open and his lower jaw level with his collarbones. My brother was poised to run and looked from the man to me and then to David in a panic. As soon as I saw the man, I took a step to run also, but realized David wasn't going anywhere, and we'd need to help him if the man tried to do anything. We weren't that far from Reno, and there are a lot of weird people who drift through that town. A man out of place in the desert is immediately considered dangerous. I settled my weight and looked the man in the eye, waiting for him to indicate his intentions. This all took about a second. At this point, my brother turned to me and screamed, "That's not a man, that's not a man." Not breaking eye contact with the man, I snapped back at him, "Yes, it is." My brother immediately yelled, "No, it's not." And I snapped right back, "Then what is it?" which shut him up. At that moment, in that situation, it was critically important to me that the man be nothing more than a man. I also knew my brother and I could probably get away, but David was at risk, and I intuitively sensed that it was important to control the fear, both by keeping the man just a man and by calming my brother. As I focused on the man, I recognized that he was not overtly threatening but seemed stern and annoyed. He didn't move a muscle, and he didn't make a sound. From his manner, I gathered that he was not threatening us but was determining if we were a threat to him, that we had disturbed him and he just wanted us to go away and leave him alone. My brother and I would have been happy to oblige, but David was still standing like a statue, and we weren't leaving him behind, so we all just stood there and stared at each other. I could see the man from the lower shins on up, and this is where it gets a little strange. He was at least 8.5 feet tall, 3.5 feet to 4 feet broad at the shoulder, and had a comparatively narrow waist. His arms hung down to the top of his knees. Not only was this man huge and slightly disproportionate, but in the middle of the afternoon, in the middle of August, to my perception, he was wearing a black down ski parka with the peaked hood up, matching black down ski pants and black gloves. Down ski wear was a brand new fad with the skiers that came through Reno back then. I thought to myself that it was strange that he had this brand new ski outfit, let alone one that fit his frame. I thought he must have stolen it. I had already subconsciously assumed this guy was a hobo because we were at least a mile from the nearest road. There wasn't a vehicle in sight, and I couldn't think of a good reason for him to have apparently been hiding in the wash. As I thought about it, the hobo assumption made sense. The ski suit was probably the only thing he had to wear, and at night, sleeping out in the open in the high desert, it tended to get a little chilly, August or not. There was even a little dirt on it in places, indicating he'd been lying on the ground in it. The man's bearing, though, didn't come across the way a homeless person would. He stood tall with his shoulders relaxed but back. His posture indicated a sense of self-worth that was almost regal, and his gaze didn't flinch. As an afterthought, there was nothing about his eyes to give me the impression that he lacked human intelligence. Even under the ski suit, you could tell that he had a massively muscled upper body, and the ratio of shoulders to waist were those of a world-class athlete. For a moment, I considered that I was looking at fur-covered muscle and immediately killed the thought, then started to look a little closer anyway. This was when he simply broke eye contact, turned, stepped down into the wash at the shallow point where he was standing and walked away down the wash without looking back. This was a little strange in retrospect, because there was absolutely no indication in body language or eye movement to telegraph that he had decided our encounter was over. He simply turned and left without acknowledgement. Within a couple of steps, he disappeared around a slight curve in the wall of the wash as it cut through the next finger off of the ridge. We stood looking at each other for maybe 45 seconds. I didn't move for a couple of seconds after he disappeared, waiting to give him time to go before moving to check on David. I'd never seen anybody so afraid that they were frozen on the spot before, and I was concerned about him. As I walked up to David, looking cautiously down the wash as I got a better angle on it, my brother followed me and said in a voice that seemed to beg me to believe him, "That wasn't a man." Standing in front of David, I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, it was. It was just a big black hobo." That ended the discussion. I asked David if he was okay. He just shook his head yes and didn't say anything. My brother moved up to the edge of the wash to see as far down it as he could, and I asked if he could see the guy. He couldn't, and we started to leave when curiosity got the better of us, and my brother asked, "What do you think he was doing down there?" I thought about it for a second and decided I wanted to know too. So we walked along the edge of the wash for 100 yards or so to make sure he wasn't hiding close enough to threaten us. The guy wasn't carrying anything, and I was worried that we would find his camp about the time he came back to it to get his belongings. We walked back down to the shallow spot in the wash and jumped down into it. I briefly recognized that the man had simply stepped down the 3 feet I had just jumped, but didn't say anything. We walked both up and down the wash 100 feet or so looking for a campsite. We didn't find one. No fire pit, no food wrappers, no trash, no drug paraphernalia, no signs that a human had been camping there. The floor of the wash was granite sand, so there really weren't any footprints that I could recognize to indicate where he may have been. We did find a spot where someone had taken pieces of tumbleweed and sticker bush and embedded them in the wall of the wash. Tumbleweed and pieces of bush were also arranged on the floor of the wash at the same spot. Those embedded in the wall of the wash were arranged in a tall half-oval, with the peak about 4.5 feet high. Those on the floor of the wash were also arranged in a half-oval that joined the first. It was about the right size for the guy to sit cross-legged in with his back against the wall of the wash. At that time, I had never heard of Bigfoot, so it wasn't even an option for me to consider within the framework of the encounter. Even though several things about the encounter were strange, I convinced myself that we had been confronted by a man. What else could it have been? About 10 days later, though, something happened that forced me to admit that there was something in the valley that was man-like but wasn't a man. This third encounter occurred in August 1972, when I was 12 at my home, roughly 10 days after our encounter at the dry wash. I have previously described nearby Peavine Mountain and Lemon Valley. Our house was located on the east side of the valley. It was in a new development at the time, tucked back in a draw among several steep hills. The surrounding hills rose from 50 to 250 feet above our neighborhood and were primarily granite outcroppings. The soil was coarse granite sand interspersed with boulders of various sizes. Where there was vegetation on the hills, it was predominantly sagebrush. In the draws, the sand was less coarse and there were a variety of grasses and other weeds. We had just moved into the newly completed house a few weeks earlier and were getting to know our neighbors, all of whom had just moved into their new homes as well. Like many of our neighbors, we were building a fence and otherwise improving our property. At the time, there was only one thing to detract from the new neighborhood: the presence of a pack of feral dogs. The pack was composed of 4 large dogs, 2 Dobermans, and a couple of mixed breeds. They were a matter of some concern because many of the new residents had small children and the pack displayed absolutely no trace of fear of people. They would generally appear around dusk, when it began to cool, and boldly range through the neighborhood. At night, you could often hear them in the surrounding hills, barking and baying occasionally. It didn't take long to determine that they had no owner, and one of our neighbors, an animal control officer for the city of Reno, told us that he had arranged for the county to do something about them. Our home was an L-shaped ranch, with 2 or 4 bedrooms in the back, at the top of the L, and a garage in front at the bottom right of the L facing the street. We had partially constructed a cedar plank fence around the property, starting in the back and working our way around the property clockwise. We had completed the fence on the side of the property at the top of the L, and had built a small section of fence connecting the back left corner of the L to the fence on that side. This created a small cul-de-sac behind the house. Along the side of the property to the right of the L, we had set the posts and rails. Along the front, where we intended to connect it to the garage, at the lower right corner of the L, we had set the posts, but hadn't yet put in the rails. You could, essentially, walk right into our backyard from the street side of the house, but could not leave the yard on the back side without climbing over the fence. On the night of the encounter, I had picked up all of the 2x4s we hadn't used as rails yet, and I had stacked them horizontally along the base of the fence back in the cul-de-sac. This was a precaution since they were pilferable, and we weren't the only ones building a new fence. My bedroom was at the top, right corner of the L. The ground outside my window was about 1.5 feet below the floor of my room. My mother had already planted a small flower bed of marigolds there. To protect it, she had me put in one of those small white-painted wire trellises that reminds you of a bunch of coat hangers welded together. To put it in, I had to heavily wet down the ground, then force it in. Once the ground dried, the powdered granite and sand set like concrete. It was about 1 foot high. The incident occurred between midnight and 12:30 a.m. It was late summer, and I was awake late reading. I had my window open, but the drapes were closed. That night, the pack of feral dogs had been more noisy than usual. Every so often, their barking would become particularly strident, drawing my attention away from my book. I remember thinking to myself, over the course of 15 minutes or so, that they were chasing another jackrabbit, then deciding that it must be a coyote since they'd been going at it for longer than usual, then wondering if they might have a cougar at bay since they were still barking and baying loudly, but seemed stationary. I was just turning back to my book when I realized that they had started moving again and were coming down the street in the direction of the house. I started to sit up, intending to go to the living room window to see what they were chasing, but realized that they would be well past the house before I could get to the living room in front. As I listened, though, the noise of the pursuit didn't decrease the way I expected it to do as they chased their quarry past the opposite side of the house. Instead, it grew louder, and I realized that, whatever they were chasing it into our backyard. I also realized that they might corner it behind the house in the cul-de-sac. Excited, I started to get up to look out the window. Before I could get up, though, their quarry rounded the back right corner of the garage, heading in the direction of my bedroom at the back right corner of the house. For just a second, I could clearly hear it running, as the sound of the dogs was still partially masked around the corner of the garage. As it covered the 20 feet between the 2 corners, I heard 3 distinct, heavy footfalls. One just as it rounded the garage, one midway between the garage and the corner of the house, and the third just under my window, where the wire trellis was set firmly into the ground. This was followed by an incredible impact into the corner of the house. The force was so great that I could hear the 4x4 upright in the wall crack and the whole room shook. The impact and cracking sound came from a point about 5.5 feet above the level of the ground outside. Simultaneously, there was a secondary impact about 7 feet above ground level across the top right corner of my window, as viewed from outside. The window rattled violently in the frame, and I was sure it was cracked. Immediately following the 2 simultaneous impacts, there was a forced grunt, as if the wind had been knocked out of whatever it was, and I could hear its body fall heavily to the ground. My first thought was, oh my God, they're chasing a man. The footfalls were clearly bipedal, The height of the impacts was too high for it to be anything four-legged, and the sound of it having its wind knocked out was man-like, if somewhat heavy. Also from the sound of its fall, it went from an erect to a prone position. At the same time, I recognized that something was strange. The man hadn't called for help, hadn't made any vocal noises at all, in fact. He had covered 20 feet in what was essentially 2 strides, and had hit the house at a point too high for all but the largest of men. The secondary impact across the outside corner of the window was also too high for most people to reach, and the force of the impact, strong enough to make the 4x4 in the house's frame crack, indicated much more mass than any normal person would have. I didn't spend any time really thinking about this, though, even though I had an underlying uneasiness because the sounds indicated that the guy was huge. I was sure the dogs were chasing a man. The dogs closed on the man, snarling and barking. I was afraid he was lying on the ground, injured or unconscious, and I realized that I had to do something. I immediately threw my sheet off, jumped out of bed, and reached for the drapes, intending to throw them open and yell at the dogs, about all I could do in the situation. In the 2 or 3 seconds it took to do this, though, it didn't sound like the dogs were mauling the man. They were about 3 feet from the house, stationary, barking and growling. It sounded as if there were only 3 of them, 2 very aggressive and ready to attack, and one that was barking the way a dog would if it were afraid of you, but ready to attack if provoked. Just as my fingertips touched the drapes, the scariest thing I have ever experienced in my life happened. Believe me, this is saying a lot for someone who has spent 19 years in the military and lived through a parachute malfunction. Somehow the man had recovered from hitting the house, having the wind knocked out of him, and falling. He had somehow managed to stand up and get his breath back, and just as I touched the drapes from a point immediately outside my window, level with and about 2 feet from my head, he growled back at the dogs. The growl wasn't loud. It was only about 2.5 seconds long, but it was the meanest, deepest, and most menacing growl I have ever heard in my life, to include those of trapped brown bears at Yellowstone. It was almost as if he was keenly aware that there were people around, that he knew precisely how long he had to growl to get his point across, and that he didn't want to make any more noise than he absolutely had to. For the next several seconds, there was absolute silence. He didn't make any more noise. The dogs didn't even make any sounds of movement, and I was frozen in fear and shock, praying that he wouldn't notice I was there and afraid he would hear me if I moved at all. It was like that for several long seconds. Then, all but silently, I heard him step and brush around the corner of the house. A second later, the dogs were after him, but the head start was all he needed. I heard the stack of 2x4s tumble down and the sound of him hitting the 6-foot cedar fence as he went over it, followed by the dogs hitting the fence and then scratching at it and barking. After a few moments, the dogs stopped trying to get over the fence and raced back around the house clockwise. As I heard the dogs racing down the street, I relaxed slightly and gulped for breath. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding it. I immediately choked. The thing had left an incredible stench. It was overpowering. It smelled like a combination of wet dog, stale urine, and rancid sweat. There was also an acrid component, a little like burnt rubber. It was so bad that I staggered away from the window. I stood there for a few moments trying to decide what to do. The thing was gone. The dogs were gone, and all I would accomplish by waking my parents would be to anger my father. I decided it wasn't worth it. I thought about going outside, but really didn't want to poke around out there in the dark. I was struggling with what I had just experienced. Whatever had been outside my window was man-like, but clearly was not a man. I had no frame of reference to place it in. I didn't relate the experience to my encounter at the dry wash, because I had so thoroughly convinced myself that that had been a man. I closed my window, which to my amazement was not broken, got back in bed and tried to read to get my mind off of the incident. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up after my father had left for work. I looked out my window and could see that the flower bed, trellis and all, had been flattened. I got dressed and went outside. The ground was scuffed, but there were no distinctive footprints. I choked down my apprehension and walked back into the fenced cul-de-sac behind the house. The stack of 2x4s was lying there toppled. I looked at the cedar fence. The scratch marks from the dog's nails were clear. Caught on the top of one of the planks was a tuft of coarse hair. I stepped up on the lower rail of the fence and looked at it closely in the bright morning sunlight. It was dark black, with hints of brownish-red highlights, and about 3 inches long. It had enough oil on it to make it shine if you looked at it closely. I struggled with whether it had come from the thing or one of the dogs. After several moments of consideration, I decided it was possible one of the Dobermans could have had some 3-inch strands of hair, that the colors were within the appropriate range, and that one of the dogs might actually have managed to make it over the fence to leave it there. I left it where it was. I went back to the window and examined it and the siding on the corner of the house closely. I didn't see any damage from the impacts. I decided that the thing had been running, hadn't seen the trellis, and had tried to cut around the corner of the house too closely. The trellis, strongly embedded in the cement-like soil, tripped it and it fell, throwing its left arm up in an attempt to maintain balance, or maybe grab the roof to catch itself. The primary impact would have been from its body. The secondary impact could have been from the left arm slapping the side of the house across the corner of the window. I went in and told my mother about the incident. I was still very troubled and wanted to know what I had heard. I discussed it at length with my father when he got home. He was uncharacteristically patient and explained that it had either been a bear or a cougar. I couldn't accept either of these explanations. It wasn't until about a year later that I ran across a tourist pamphlet in Oregon that was about Bigfoot. I can't express how relieved I was at the time to learn that there was a potential explanation for what I had experienced. We never saw or heard the dogs again after that night.
In my opinion, the most damning piece of evidence against the existence of Bigfoot is the fact that its reported appearance keeps changing. In Native American mythology, the hairy man was a humanoid specter, a nebulous hairy humanoid with no textualized, fixed to match a certain canon description outside of that. The wild man is an extremely common mythological trope that dates back to the epic of fucking Gilgamesh. Basically, it's a human that lives like an animal, something that exists as an in-between of the two states of humanity. It has the appearance of an adult human, but lives in a state of natural innocence. Prior to 1900, Bigfoot was described as either a hairy, scary forest monster or the archetypical wild man. However, after the discovery of human ancestors and basal hominins in the early 1900s, Bigfoot was suddenly an ape man. Instead of being either a purely ape-like monster or a hobo, Bigfoot now combined human and ape-like characteristics to match the new popular images of the wild man. Even so, descriptions of Bigfoot varied wildly. He could be more ape-like or more human-like, but was still more or less identical to the most recently discovered fossil anthropoid, with the expected embellishments that make a good story. It wasn't until the Patterson-Gimlin film that the image of Bigfoot became textualized and fixed as the giant ape monster that's commonplace today. Compare this to the descriptions of Nessie. For the longest time, Nessie was usually described as a humpbacked, horse-headed serpent, similar to kelpies or the heraldic hippocampus. This persisted until the discovery of plesiosaurus fossils in the UK. Then, all of a sudden, Nessie sightings started describing her as a plesiosaur more and more often. Then, the surgeon's photograph came to popular attention, and bam! Nessie was permanently a relict Sauropterygian. Bigfoot does exist, but only in the form that it's always existed in, a folkloric artifact.
Maybe this has been brought up, and if so, I apologize. I'm not going to read every comment. I'm not an outright believer, but I am open-minded. I think that the theory that these creatures are actually an offshoot of humanity. Humans who have lived in the wild for generations can be completely impossible for anyone to find if they don't want to be found. We are still finding Stone Age tribes in the Amazon. In a small enough population, or one that is spread out between small tribes over hundreds of miles, we may never find evidence of them being there at all. As to the fact that no remains are found, could they not bury their dead, or even eat them? The Native American tribes all have stories about them. They claim they have their own language, and they refer to them as cannibal giants because of their size and tendency to kidnap members of their tribes and eat them. If a primitive culture had its own language, would it not be possible that they had certain rituals for their dead? Furthermore, why would you call a man-eating creature a cannibal if it was not in fact a sort of human? Again, I haven't seen enough evidence to fully convince me, but I'd say if I were looking for valid info, I'd trust the people that have been living beside them for thousands of years.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.